Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting Professor X and the Shadowking for Marvel Crisis Protocol. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is spray them both white with some matte white spray from Colourforge. Next, I'm going to start working on the Professor X's exhaust port, which according to the box art is a sort of grey. So for that, I'm going to use some Abaddon Black. And I'm also going to use that to paint the back of his seat. Both of these areas will then be followed with some Corvus Black. Then this will be followed with some Eshin Grey. However, I'm going to kind of dry brush it or do an overbrush on the exhaust rather than just neatly paint it on. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Dawnstone. And once again, I'm going to dry brush on the exhaust and do an edge highlight on the chair. For one final highlight, I'm just going to use some Dawnstone by itself, just to dry brush the very tips of the exhaust. Next, I'm going to use Temple Guard Blue to paint Professor X's shirt. Then I'm going to use some Macragge Blue to paint what I can only assume is the astral form of the Shadowking. I'll then wash both these sections of blue with some Drakenhof Nightshade. Once those washes have dried, we're going to use Temple Guard Blue to relayer the shirt on Professor X. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Temple Guard Blue and Barahoth Blue. And then finally a little bit of Barahoth Blue just to pick out the collars. Then we'll use some Macragge Blue to dry brush the astral form of the Shadowking. This will be followed by a 70-30 mix in favour of Macragge Blue and Temple Guard Blue. Continuing the dry brush and staying with that same mix, but this time at a 50-50 ratio. Then sticking with that same mix, but this time at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Temple Guard Blue. Make sure that with each successive dry brush, we're getting lighter and lighter as we go. The next dry brush will be using some Temple Guard Blue just by itself. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Temple Guard Blue and Barahoth Blue. Then that same mix, but at a 30-70 ratio in favour of Barahoth Blue. And then finally a dry brush of Barahoth Blue, but this is mostly focused on the absolute peaks and tips. After that huge dry brushing session, we're then going to start to prep the next dry brushing session, and for that we're going to use some Screamer Pink on the lower half of the Astral Planes form. I'm then going to use Barak Nar Burgundy to paint Professor X's tie. And I'll also use it to paint the shirt and the fez on the Shadowking. Then both those colours will then receive a wash with some Druchii Violet. And while that wash starts to dry, we're going to paint the blanket on Professor X with some Mournfang Brown. This will be given its own wash, but this time we're going to use some Agrax Earthshade. Once the Druchii Violet wash has dried, we're going to relayer the Barak Nar Burgundy, making sure we avoid any recesses and just to pick things out a little bit better. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Barak Nar Burgundy and matte white for the first highlight. And then finally this same mix but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of matte white for the second. Now we're going to move back to the dry brushing of the astral form. We're going to use a 70-30 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror, and don't worry if you catch it on the blue, that's kind of what you want to do to help those colours blend in together. This will be followed by the same mix but at a 50-50 ratio. Then once again the same mix but this time at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Pink Horror. The next one we're just going to use Pink Horror just by itself. And then finally a 50-50 mix of Pink Horror and matte white. With all the dry brushing out of the way, we're going to move back to Professor X and his blanket. And for that, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. This will be followed by Scrag Brown just by itself. Next, I want to paint a small, very wide checkered pattern onto the blanket using some Rakarth flesh. Don't worry if you don't want to do this. This is a step you can entirely skip. Then, to paint both white suits, as both Professor X and the Shadowking are wearing white, we're going to use some Grey Seer. And then we're going to use some Apothecary White to give the Grey Seer a little bit more shading. Next, while that dries, I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel on the bracelets and the armbands of the astral form of the Shadowking, which I'll give a quick wash with some Nuln Oil. So once the wash on the suits has dried, I'm then going to relayer the Grey Seer, taking care to avoid any recesses. This will then be followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White. And then lastly, Matte White all by itself. Next we're going to move on to their skin, and for that I'm going to use Bugman's Glow. And then I'm going to use some Retributor armor to catch the very top of the Shadowking's staff. Excuse the terrible shot, I didn't realise I completely missed. And I'm also going to use a Retributor armor to paint all of Professor X's chair. Then both the skin and the chair and any other gold will receive a wash with some Reikland Flesh Shade. Moving back to the Shadowking's astral form, I'm just going to give the Iron Hand Steel a quick highlight with Iron Hand Steel, making sure I just avoid the recesses. And once the wash has dried on the skin, I'm then going to use some Abaddon Black to pick out Professor X's eyes. And I'm also going to use it to paint the little pop-up computer on his chair. Then I'm going to use some Matte White to put the bulk of his eyes in place. It's a really weird way I phrased that. And then I'm going to dot his pupils with some more Abaddon Black. And while I've still got the Abaddon Black out, I'm going to use it to paint the glasses on the Shadowking. And a little bit of thread that comes down from the top of the fez. And lastly, his cane and his boots. Then I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone to start highlighting the skin. This will be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And then finally Kislev Flesh just by itself to pick out the absolute peaks and tips. I'm then going to relayer Professor X's chair with some Retributor armor. And this will be followed by a highlight of a 50-50 mix of Retributor armor and Uruk Armor Gold. Next, I'll edge highlight everything with Uruk Armor Gold just by itself, before finally doing a 50-50 mix of Uruk Armor Gold and Stormhost Silver to do the corners and very sharp edges. I'll use a quick bit of Corvus Black to highlight the computer on Professor X's chair. And then in a blurry shot where I completely miss the camera, I'm going to use some Matte White to pick out the teeth on both the astral form of the Shadowking and the Shadowking himself. I'm also going to use that Matte White to do a very small highlight on the edges of the Shadowking's glasses. Also, as Professor X in the comics has great big bushy eyebrows, I'm going to use a little bit of Abaddon Black to draw those in place. You can skip this part if you wish. Then, in a shot where I completely miss the camera again, I'm going to use some Mephiston Red to place in the eyes of the astral form of the Shadowking. Again, really weird phrasing with the eyes. I don't know what's going on with me today. Then, in an almost as bad but not quite as bad shot, I'm going to use some Evil Sun Scarlet to pick out the eyes. I'm then going to use Iron Hand Steel to pick out the metallic parts or any metal parts on the bases. Dawnstone to paint all of the concrete. And this will be edge highlighted with some Grey Seer. And then I'm going to paint the rims of the bases with Abaddon Black. Lastly, I use some watered down Agrax Earthshade to cover the entire base. And there we are. That's the Shadowking and Professor X finished. A pair of absolutely lovely models. Kind of wish I actually got them sooner than I did, as I got them about a year after they released. They are such a blast to paint, and they only took around about 4.5 hours to paint for the pair. If you're collecting Marvel Crisis Protocol, and specifically the X-Men, I wholeheartedly recommend getting this set if you don't have it already. If, like me, you're lagging behind because they keep releasing so many of them and they are quite expensive to buy, but they are always worth it in my opinion. I really do love buying the Marvel Crisis Protocol stuff. They're beautiful models, very well made, and always a blast to paint. If you follow this guide, I really do hope it helped. If you want to see more, there's plenty more Marvel Crisis Protocol stuff on the channel, so give me a subscribe, and I guess I'll see you on the next one. Thanks again so much for watching, and goodbye for now.